Welcome. I'm Tim Hanstead from the Chandler Foundation. I'm coming to you today from Seattle on the traditional land of the Salish people. And the Chandler Foundation is proudly co-hosting this event along with Adesso and Catalyst 2030. We have a terrific panel today, and we have significant opportunities for you, the audience members, to engage during the event, so get ready for those. We are recording this session, and the recording link will be made available later this week. We'll send it out to all of you. I encourage you all to use the speaker view rather than the gallery view to experience today's event. I think that'll work better for you. And here is how our 90 minutes is going to go. After a very brief intro, instructions for me, we're going to start with some poll questions for you, the audience, so we can better understand who is out there and better understand some of your views on today's topic, which, as you know, is decolonizing aid and philanthropy. Then I'm going to introduce our panelists and ask two of them, Dagan Ali from Adesso and Don Steinberg from USAID, to make some initial framing background remarks. We'll then move to a moderated discussion of all four panelists, and the moderated discussion will be followed by a Q&A featuring questions from you in the audience. We'll then close with another question for all of you in the audience and very brief final remarks from all the panelists. So I encourage all of you in the audience to submit comments and questions during the moderated discussion. Submit them in the chat. I'm not sure we'll be able to get to all of them, but we will try. And we want to make this an engaging session for everyone who attends. And speaking of making an engaging session, we are going to start with an audience poll. And we have a poll of 7 questions. I'm going to give you about 90 seconds to read through and answer them. I encourage you to do it quickly. Trust your first instinct. And in about 90 seconds, we'll all take a look at the responses together. Minority of people are still finishing up, but we're going to I encourage those of you who have finished to look through the answers. Question 1, about the organization you represent. We have 44% are from social purpose organizations, about 33% from donor organizations, and about 21% from other. Where are you tuning in from? About 2/3 from North America, 1/5 from Europe, 12% from Africa, very small percentage from Asia. That might have something to do with we're not being too time zone friendly for Asia. Sorry for those, and thank you for those of you from Asia who are joined. What term do you use most often in regards to the work we are discussing today? About equal numbers, interesting, among decolonization, localization, and locally led development. But I know sometimes the terms we use can sometimes trip us up. But I find that very interesting, about 1/3 on each. And on a scale of 1 to 5, how much do multilateral and bilateral funders need to change? Most of the answers, the vast majority, are at number 4 and 5. So that means they need to change a lot. And on a scale of 1 to 5, how much does philanthropy need to change? Again, a vast majority on 4 and 5, a bit more have answered 3, and a very small amount on 2 there. On a scale of 1 to 5, question number 6, how much is the locally led development a priority in your organization? 57% say 5, that means a high priority. The next is 4, 22%, 13% for 3. And what percentage, question number 7, what percentage of your organization's resources, funding, time, energy, are going towards locally led development? And here, the top answer was 50 to 75%, from 30% of responses, 25% responses said 75 to 100%, and 23 responses, 25 to 50. Okay, well, thank you for participating in the poll. I'm not sure if we can continue to keep this open for those who are joining late or who didn't get a chance to join it, but we are going to have to jump in to the discussion, and I want to get to the panel. Let's jump to them now. And as I said earlier, I am delighted and honored that we're able to attract such a terrific and diverse group of leaders for us to learn from today. I'm going to introduce them briefly. I think we're going to be able to put their LinkedIn links in the chat so that you can take a look at them, because my brief introductions are not going to do any of them justice. We're going to start with Dagan Ali. Dagan's the executive director of ADESO, which is a humanitarian development organization that is changing the way people think about and deliver aid in the Global South. Dagan's an activist, an advocate, and a leader in the decolonization of development movement. She was an architect of the Grand Bargain commitment of 25% of funding to go directly to local organizations. Dagan also co-founded the Network for Empowered Aid Response, NEAR, a global South civil society network trying to transform the current humanitarian development system. She also serves as a consultant to several leading international NGOs on issues around today's topic. And her methodology and perspectives on international aid and African development have been featured in numerous leading publications. So Dagan, we're thrilled to be co-hosting with ADESO and you today, and welcome. Next, we have Don Steinberg, Ambassador Don Steinberg, who serves as an expert advisor to USAID Administrator Samantha Power, where he focuses on expanding locally led development, realigning US policies with the SDGs, and promoting diversity, equity, and inclusion. Don has a long and distinguished history in the public sector, including as Deputy Administrator at USAID in the Obama administration, Ambassador to Angola, and Director of the State Department's Joint Policy Council, among other positions. He's also served as a President and CEO of World Learning and has helped lead and advise countless other civil society organizations and government institutions. So thank you, Don, for joining us today and representing USAID. Next, we have Salome Lema. Salome is the Executive Director of Thousand Currents, a terrific organization that mobilizes resources and relationships to grassroots partners working on the front lines of just and equitable change. Previously, she co-founded and led Africans in the Diaspora and served as Global Fund for Children Senior Program Officer for Africa. Born in Ethiopia and having moved to the United States at a young age, Salome quickly learned of the skewed perspective of many people hold of Africans. I just want to ask people please to go on mute. Thank you. As a co-founder of Africa Responds, Salome led a diaspora-led humanitarian effort to galvanize fundraising for grassroots organizations that fought the Ebola outbreak in parts of West Africa. She is a White House champion of change and a fierce supporter of local leadership. Her work and writing has been featured in leading publications, and she's appeared on NPR, BBC, and Al Jazeera discussing aid and philanthropy in Africa. Thank you for joining us, Salome, and we're looking forward to hearing from you. And Finally, Abby Maxman. Abby is the president and CEO of Oxfam America. I'm sure we're all familiar with Oxfam America. Abby mobilizes people and resources worldwide for positive social change. Since joining Oxfam in 2017, 5 years ago, she has elevated its focus on gender, human justice, and fighting inequality. She's been at the forefront of Oxfam's ambitious 2030 strategy, which emphasizes a radical shifting of resources and power to people directly experiencing marginalization. Abby's approach is informed by her experience living and working through challenging periods of rapid social change, development, and disaster in numerous other countries, including Ethiopia, Rwanda, Haiti, Georgia, as well as serving with CARE, several US government agencies, the German Development Agency, and the UN World Food Program. Welcome, Abby, and welcome to all of the panelists. We're in for a treat here. And to start us off, I have asked Dagan and Dawn to start with us with some framing remarks, some background remarks for today's topic. So first, I'm going to turn to you, Dagan, from your experience as a Global South civil society leader who has been working on today's topic for many years. Please give us your framing of the topic.
Thank you, Tim. And it's a great honor to be co-hosting this with you and Catalyze 2030. And thank you all for attending. Yeah, I mean, I think just a quick kind of recap of what got us here to this conversation. This issue of whatever you call it, locally led development, community-led development, localization, whichever language you use, has been a long outstanding issue. And it was even resonating very strongly at the time of the famine response in Ethiopia in the early 90s. It's been something that's been advocated in the tsunami response, where we saw just some crazy programming happening on the ground, and huge waste of resources and a lot of what they call white elephants. It's been a recurring issue, I would say, every 10, 15 years in the sector, where we have this, come to Jesus moment about how broken the aid system is. And it happened again in 2014 during the World Humanitarian Summit, where basically the Global South organizations came together and united and started advocating for some equality in the sector. At that time, only 0.2% of humanitarian funding was going directly to local organizations. So you can imagine the billions and billions of billions. I think it's about $24 to $27 billion in the humanitarian space. That's not development, where that is being spent on an annual basis, and only about 0.2% was going directly to local organizations, and layers of intermediation that takes place, and it still takes place. And that's when we organized ourselves and we're working on establishing the NEAR network, which was successfully founded in 2016. But that's when we came up with the target. We said there has to be a target, because when the WHS, everybody leaves Turkey, people are just going to go away and the status quo will remain. So the target for me was very important as a way to keep the bilaterals around the table and to ensure that this conversation doesn't die. And at that time, it was 20% by 2020, and through a lot of allies and a lot of things happening and perfectly aligning, we were able to get it accepted into the grand bargain localization commitment that became 25% and was even increased. I'm sorry to say that grand bargain commitment today in 2022, none of the bilateral donors have met it. But it's still important, because that target not dying and still being a target, an ambition, a courageous aspirational ambition, is what I think has heavily influenced the likes of Samantha Power, just revitalizing the whole conversation and taking the lead. I think she's the only major bilateral donor that has come out recently recommitting to 25%, and even going further. There's another 50% target that USAID has that Don will talk about. So I think that's just a little bit of background. But the localization terminology became a term that was used to describe our movement for equality and justice in this space. And it's a term I've never liked. It was imposed on us. I feel it's very pejorative. Why is it that when we are in the South, we're local, when people in the UK and DC are international? Why is that? We're all local in our respective locations, and we're all international when we cross borders. But somehow the terminology is that, you know, we're localizing you and we're localizing this agenda, and you don't deserve the international status that we have. And it's a very hierarchical, and it relates a lot to this hierarchy around expatriates and national staff and field and international and all of that. So for us, it was really important to recapture the narrative and start talking about decolonization and recognizing the political root causes of why these inequity exist. It's not by accident, it's not by happenstance, it's by design why aid is broken. And so the political angle of aid and development is something that's rarely talked about. And that's for why it was important for us in 2020 to start using the term decolonization. And I mean, why is funding to local actors important? I think, if we have to justify this issue in 2022, I think it really speaks to how far behind the sector is, that we have to actually justify why grassroots organizations, people most closest to the problem, should be the ones dealing with it. Do community organizers in DC have to justify why they're working on the issue instead of, let's say, Ghanaians coming in and working on these issues from Ghana? Imagine if a crisis happened tomorrow in the UK, a massive flood, and people from Singapore started flooding in and started in that response. There would be no conversation about it. Everybody would be constantly questioning, well, why is that happening? But for somehow we're always put in this position of having to justify why, being the communities themselves first and foremost, and then the local organizations who are the de facto representatives of those communities should be the ones on the ground leading in a response, whether humanitarian or whether it's a development intervention. We know that it has more impact. We also know that it's more efficient. Everybody keeps talking about the lack of resources. There is no lack of resources. The layers of intermediation that takes place, where every dollar goes through layers and layers of UN and INGOs, and only 0.2% gets directly on the ground, is extremely costly for the sector, and means that money that was meant for the communities and to actually serve vulnerable people is now serving high salaries and expatriates and Americans and all of these other things that go into that layers of intermediation. And I think, frankly, if we are serious about this conversation around justice and equality that is taking place heavily in the US, that it needs to be reflected in our foreign policy, and it needs to be reflected in our actions on how resources are distributed in the global South. So I think for all of those reasons, it's a very important and way overdue conversation. And I would like to see us, I'm very happy to see that this issue hasn't died, but at the same time, we need to move now from rhetoric to actual action. We can't keep talking about it over and over every year. It's been a prominent issue in my 20 plus years in the sector. But at this point, we need to start seeing foundations, and we need to start seeing bilaterals like what Samantha Power has done, and other bilaterals joining that effort, and actually seeing the needle moving in that direction, where we see USAID actually moving closer and closer to their 25 and their 50% target. And seeing other bilaterals doing the same, such as DFID or FCDO and others. So that's my challenge to the larger community is, while we're really happy about the fact that this issue hasn't died, that's not good enough for us. And now we need to really turn it into real practical solutions for people in the global South. Thank you.
Thanks, Megan. That was a very helpful framing. Thank you for the framing and for the challenge. Dawn, I want to transition to you. You're a U.S. diplomat with 30 years of experience. give us your perspective of how we got here, and maybe commenting on the where we've come from, maybe the terms which Dagan touched on, and the fact that, as Dagan said, that USAID now has revitalized the conversation. Where did that come from, and where's USAID going with this?
Well, thank you, Tim, and thanks to Chandler and Odessa and Catalyze 2030 for bringing us here today. I'm really tempted just to say I agree with what Dagan has said and leave it at that, because I think she focused on so many of the issues that indeed have driven our rising concern over these issues. I also, on the terms, I literally have conversations on a weekly basis with Samantha Power, and she agrees strongly with what Dagan is saying. She said publicly in April, localization sounds like we are the center of the universe and they are the planet circulating around us. So we do have to come up with a different term to use, but as your poll said, you know, there's uncertainty. We've got about a third of the people on each of your areas. The other thing I wanted to comment on before getting to your question is the poll question on, do bilaterals need to change? Where 92% of the responses were big time. And let me say, I firmly agree with that. And I'm a 5 on that question. So whether you call it localization or decolonizing foreign assistance, community-led development, this movement to change the power dynamic in the current humanitarian, but also development assistance arena, it's never been stronger. Simply put, we at AID and other stakeholders throughout this ecosystem, we've learned that our efforts can't be effective, they can't be resilient, and they can't be equitable unless local partners play a lead role in identifying sectors, creating and planning programs, implementing projects, and evaluating the achievements. And I think Dagan is right that one of the reasons that it has reached a new level of interest is that we have seen very slow progress in achieving the Sustainable Development Goals, and certainly the humanitarian grand bargain that she referred to. And now this is complicated by climate change and global pandemic issues. These are stark reminders that the ground truth, the credibility, and the accountability that local actors bring to the table are essential for achieving our collective objectives. By contrast, the current power game, where the deck is stacked to give all the best cards to the bilaterals, to the multilateral donors, to the UN agencies, to foreign NGOs and development contractors, that has to change. I also think it's important that this localization effort draws on the growing global embrace of diversity, equity, inclusion, and accessibility. Localization means changing the power dynamics, not just changing flows of dollars, but changing the power dynamic to ensure a seat at the table, and preferably at the head of the table for local actors under the principle of nothing about us without us. And this just doesn't mean the traditional NGOs or government entities in our partner countries. It means that we will listen to the voices of marginalized populations. We have to bring women to the table, people with disabilities, young people, the LGBTQI plus community, indigenous populations, displaced people, and ethnic and religious minorities. And what I think is really important, just to conclude here, about the new approach that Administrator Power has brought to USAID is it goes beyond specific sectors or programs. and it provides a cross-cutting lens through which we're going to look at all of our global challenges, whether it's COVID, climate change, democratic governance, anti-corruption, population displacement. We're also committing ourselves to a new humility and a new flexibility. We have to adapt our systems and procedures to accommodate new and smaller partners who don't know our complex application and compliance procedures, who don't have English as their principal language or even a colonial language. Many indigenous populations are, not fluent in even the colonial language. We also need to change our reporting requirements. And I look forward to talking about the specific steps we're going to take later in the program. But again, all of that just to say ditto to the comments that Dagan Ali just made.
Thanks, Don. Well, if my job was to identify like contrary points of view, I haven't been able to do that well so far because it sounds like you're remarkably aligned. But thank you for those remarks. I want to turn to Salome first and then to Abby, and same question for both of you. I want you to just react to the framing that Dagan and Dawn shared of the issue. Do you have any strong reactions, either positive or negative, to anything you heard, or maybe additional points that I think might be helpful to round out the framing of today's topic? Salome, maybe you first.
Thank you, Tim, and thank you, Dawn and Dagan. I also want to say ditto and pass the mic. Yes, yes. I do want to just highlight and surface a few points that I thought were really important. Dagan, thank you for talking about kind of language. What do we mean by localization? Language matters because language informs narratives and the stories we tell ourselves, and that informs the cultures that we build, which in turn informs the policies and practices we establish for ourselves, right? And all the terms we use matter in our sector, whether it's localization, capacity, beneficiary, even everyone's favorite term these days, solidarity. It's really important for us to interrogate what we mean and why it matters. And that's the case for the term decolonization as well, right? What do we mean when we say we're decolonizing? And I think for me, decolonization really means when the institutions we built, like philanthropy or aid, are no longer needed, right? That's when we're actually fully decolonized, when they're not needed in the same way that we need them now to help create or support the creation of just and equitable societies, because we built those just and equitable societies. And to get to that place, we're far off from there, right? That's a multi-generational process. But we start from where we are now. And if that's our North Star, then it really requires shifts and practices, as we've discussed just now, but also shifts in our structures, how our organizations are structured, shifts in our values and our culture. It's a holistic process of transformation. It requires that we deconstruct the values, cultures, practices, assumptions that are harmful, and construct new ways of organizing ourselves and organizing our organizations. And if that's the case, as Dawn was saying, decolonization is really fundamentally about power. It's about realigning, restructuring, and shifting power, and how we relate to power ourselves as individuals, how we relate to power within our institutions, and how we relate to power collectively as a society.
Thanks, Salome. And as I was listening to you and also to Dawn and to Dagan, I was reminded that the title of today's session does have systems change in the title, systems change in action. And I think it was Dawn who said earlier, this is not just about changing resources and resource flows. It's about changing power dynamics. And also your comments about the language matters, and also Dagan's, is that the language can reflect or inform mindsets. And I'm just remembering that upside down triangle that some of you are familiar with about the 6 factors of systems change. The explicit ones at the top being about resource flows and about changes in policies or maybe organization structures. Those are the more explicit ones. At the very bottom and foundational is changing the mindsets, and then which is very implicit, and then in between we have the changing of power dynamics. So we're touching upon all of these factors in what really is systems change and needed systems change here. So Abby, over to you. Same prompt. I mean, you lead this fabulous organization in Oxfam International, also a member of Oxfam International. You've been contributing to these in many ways, but as an international NGO, you sit in a bit of a different space in it all. So yeah, respond to the framing.
Yeah, thanks, Tim and Dagan and Don and Salome. It's really great to be part of this discussion. And I'm glad, well, my first comment is ditto again. So that's not very original. But really, I'm glad you talked about the systems and the ecosystems we're all a part of, because as an international NGO that was born out of World War II and the ecosystem that we're all operating in, we have a particular duty and responsibility to be making change both from within in modeling behaviors consistent with what we say and all that we do. And we have lots of failings in that journey. And we've had to look inside and out of how do we use our knowledge, experience, resources, power and money, which at the end of the day, this is all about, to make change of how we work inside our confederation, working around the world, and also in the spaces we are privileged to sit. And I'm glad Dagan talked about the journey up to the Grand Bargain and Charter for Change and all the commitments that were made then and there, that we as a community, as a system, have not met the targets in any way that we believe are the right thing to do. And as Oxfam, we set our own targets at the time at 5% higher. We said 25% isn't good enough, let's do 30%. We measure and we continue to not be where we want to be in terms of, in the humanitarian space, as one example, how resources flow. In some examples, in some contexts, we have been more successful. In the Philippines is one example where closer to 90%, but in other fragile, complex countries and contexts, we're very low. And we have to look at how do we work as a partner. What does partnership mean? How do we decolonize not just decision-making and resources and power, but even the decolonization of knowledge, and how when we show up in a conversation and in a partnership, we're able to invest and share and also learn and receive with that deep humility that Don also mentioned. And maybe before we go back to the larger discussion, I just want to both appreciate again USAID's commitment, the new vision for global development, as the ambitious targets that it needs to be, but what are all of our responsibilities to help hold USAID accountable to being a leader in that regard, and not look at ways money flows and it just is a new way of getting resources to international NGOs who've then nationalized. We strongly disagree with that as an approach, and we're going to be a voice, an active voice in, and have already been, in how do we look at the support and resource flow to indigenous organizations, to those who are of all sizes, who might not be in the spaces to influence, and how do we serve as an enabler in a positive sense, and look at the incentives in the system and kind of weed out the disincentives, the bad behaviors, and the disablers that are there.
Thanks, Abby, and thanks again for reminding us about the history, because I think thinking of the history of the organizations that we represent or involved in and where we've come from is so important. Dawn, I want to come back to you and get to maybe some of the specifics. As a lawyer, I can say something that the devil can be in the details, so I want to get into some of the details. So for USAID, how do you determine what is considered local? How do you define local? What qualifies, what doesn't qualify? And what are the justifications for the qualifications?
Well, it's a great question, and it's one that we've been trying to address since the administrator announced in November our 25% and our 50% commitments. And I think, again, what we're talking about is only one part of the larger agenda. But to get very specific, she did pledge 25% of USAID's direct funding will go to civil society and business groups in our partner countries in the next 4 years. And that is up from 6.2% in 2021. So it's a major challenge for us. We define it for that dynamic. We have a very clear local entity definition, and it stresses 5 conditions: making sure the board of directors is local, making sure its principal line of business is local, making sure that the decision-making processes occur through local systems, et cetera. It's in our regulations ADS 303 right now, and we're going to continue to use that metric, which we've used for the last 10 years. But we recognize that that metric doesn't necessarily change power dynamics, and it doesn't necessarily encourage community-led development. That just focuses on the nationality of our partners. And so she also made a 50% commitment that our projects over the next decade will put local partners in the lead to co-design projects, to set priorities, to drive implementation, to evaluate the impact of programs, and to truly empower local actors defined as those that have credibility and accountability and the confidence of the local communities. That can include government-to-government assistance, where there are governments who are responsive to local needs. It can include even assistance that is provided through international organizations of a certain type, or assistance even provided through implementing partners if the relationship between the, in this case, Washington or US-based NGO or development contractor, puts the power dynamic in the hands of local actors. We also recognize that there are 2 other types of assistance that we really want to encourage, and one is government-to-government assistance where it is projectized, where you're actually doing projects on the ground that have local commitment to them. And secondly, as I said, the subawards or the grants under contracts that many NGOs in the United States have, but they have to be empowering of the local actors, and that's the key.
Thanks, Don. Abby, Oxfam America is one of the few international NGOs that does not receive funding from USAID. And can you just explain a bit about why you chose not to pursue that funding and what it's meant for you?
Great, thanks, Tim, and kind of a perfect segue being here on the panel today, and with Don representing USAID. You know, when Oxfam America came into being a little later than the founding member of the Confederation, about more than 50 years ago, one of the key principles that was what we would not accept U.S. government funding because we felt it was fundamental to be an independent voice in influencing how overseas development assistance, as is called in some framing, would flow. And we wanted to hold the US government accountable for its foreign policy and practice. And that has remained a core part of our identity so that we could be that independent voice to sit with Dawn and others in DC and elsewhere in missions around the world to bring our voice so that we could be holding accountable the US government for the better practices. And so hearing today, Dawn, you talking about some of the commitments about how the definitions of the local board at 51%, for example, as Oxfam, we're arguing, and with some others, that the definition of local should be 80% a local board. And so those kind of dialogues are fundamental in pushing, shifting, understanding, and holding each other accountable for what change looks like. Is in the United States as a US NGO in a large ecosystem of NGOs, we have want to make sure that our boards also are comprised of people from a diverse set of backgrounds in service to the work that we do, both domestically as a social justice organization fighting inequality to end poverty, and how we work in the Confederation as a whole to influence policy and practice. So those are the kind of reasons we continue to maintain our position that not accepting US government funds is so vital to be that independent voice in our community. And what is meant is we do not have the same resources or the resource flow, or even some things that affect how we're evaluated, such as ratios, which, as we know, there's different watchdogs and navigating organizations that look at some of the mega grants that USAID gives, and that becomes a bit of a cloak or a fig leaf behind which organizations can hide in terms of how resources are flowing. And so we think it is our responsibility to work within that and to see how we can also maximize not just resource flow, but the decision making. And we do that inside the Confederation and looking at our own global governance and governance reform agenda that we've been working on for some years, and how we show up and work as a partner in the countries where we work around the world and in the United States.
Thanks so much, Abby. And Oxfam took this position, Oxfam America, from 1970 or?
Yes, and since we were founded in the late 60s and in the backdrop of some of what was happening around the world, we know that what was happening in the colonization, decolonization efforts and movements, and this was something, a founding principle. And I want to say, it hasn't always been easy because we're part of a global confederation. We know that the US government is incredibly generous, and that's what we want, that generosity reaching all the places, all the countries around the world at the community level. We know who first responders are always, or local communities. We've learned that during COVID as well. People in the United States have felt that too. Wherever you sit, you're responding to a crisis in your home, in your community. And so that's been part of our journey. But it means that it's hard saying no to resources at a time, especially in resource-starved context where the ecosystem, back to the aid construct, might not be investing sufficiently in some of the forgotten or neglected contexts.
Thank you. I want to turn to you, Salome, and kind of transition the discussion to philanthropy, because we're again, in the title of our session, it's about decolonizing aid and philanthropy. And so far, we've been focusing on the public sector aid side, the bilaterals. But as in a session yesterday, I think it was Brendan Cullen reminded us that of cross-border development humanitarian flows, about 95% of it does come from bilaterals and multilaterals, and only 5% from philanthropy. So the volume of dollars may not be as large, but the flexibility and like less, I think we operate under less constraints, certainly less political constraints. So 1,000 Currents funds grassroots groups. How does this work in fit into the broader puzzle of decolonizing philanthropy? And what, from your perspective, needs to be decolonized in philanthropy to be a better and more effective partner for grassroots local organizations and communities?
And that's a great question. And it is true, we have more flexibility and maybe even just less accountability, but we can talk about that later. And philanthropy has made efforts, it's particularly since the pandemic, to relax some of its restrictions and measures, but there's work that's still left around how we can decolonize the sector as a whole. And we can spend a whole session talking about it, but some of the, I think, key areas and highlights are just decolonizing who we fund, how we fund, what we fund, and what we believe, right, as a sector. And in terms of who we fund, it builds off of the conversation we've been having so much. Even within philanthropy, the majority of funding is not going to frontline or local organizations. And we're mixing out on a significant amount of innovation, vision, strategy, and impact. And we still have a limited understanding of what local organizations are, right? And what local organizing looks like. Local organizing looks like a community-based organization and looks like a local or national nonprofit organization. Local organizing looks like a movement, a social movement. And local organizing looks like unstructured, unregistered organizations that are still doing equally powerful work, and we're not reaching them. We're still not reaching them. And that is where the heart of community and the heart of change lives. Secondly, it's around how we fund. The majority of funding, especially international funding, it's still heavily restricted and limited in terms of time, right? So it's project-based funding and it's time-bound funding, but that's getting in the way of innovation, experimentation, effectiveness, and impact. It's basically tying an organization's hand and saying, go and do the work right now. That's just not going to get us the kind of changes that we seek as a community and as a sector and society. Thirdly, it's around what we fund, right? We're still funding projects. We're still funding our own ideas and strategies around what change looks like in another place, as opposed to investing in and funding organizing and organizations and visions and strategies that belong to the people who are most directly impacted by the challenges we face. And lastly, there's work that we still have left around our beliefs, our values, our structures and systems that we started to touch on, right? The idea that we know better, that we can do things for people is an assumption that we still need to interrogate. The idea that we don't fund local groups, or when we do, it's restricted because they're risky. What does risk mean? And who do we consider risky in our sector? Because money flows abundantly to some who do not have a proven record or evidence of impact, and it's heavily limited to those who actually have a lived experience of the changes they seek. So what does risk look like? Why do we not trust local organizations, local organizing? And what is that rooted in? Questions around our ideas of capacity and who has it and who builds it is something we need to decolonize. Idea of capacity building projects as well as absorptive capacity, right? How we measure absorptive capacity of an organization and the scale of resources they can receive, and our ideas of scale, this idea that local organizing is not scalable. So at best, we can support them to implement local projects that have micro level impact, but we're not going to see macro level change. And that's really false, because we know from history, any significant social change that has taken place, it's because of people organizing locally, nationally, and globally to bring about that change. And that is the stronger infrastructure for social transformation that we have, that philanthropy is still missing out on. And lastly, it's around the work of decolonizing requires internal examination. Who's on our leadership? Who's on our board? What kind of decision-making processes do we have in place? What kind of structures do we have in place to embody the equity and justice we want to see in the world internally?
Wow, so well said. Thank you. Dagan, we need to get back to you. I want to ask you about some of the constraints or perceived constraints, at least the Global North funders have, or say they have, as they approach this issue for those who want to do better. One is around networks. So the Global North Fund lacks the networks to become connected to Global South organizations. how can they best do it? How can they best address at least, well, what have you seen as the perceived kind of obstacles for global North funders who say, I want to do this, but maybe I'm not positioned well enough to go to do it? How do we address the issues around networks, around the perceptions of, as Salome already talked about, risk capacity, absorptive capacity?
Yeah, Tim, before I respond to that, I want to just add something to what Salome said. I completely agree with that list that she's provided. I just want to add a few things. One, I think if we were really serious about decolonization and recognizing that philanthropy has a level of flexibility that doesn't exist with bilaterals, this is where the space that philanthropists can fill, which they have done with like the Black Lives Matter movement. I mean, that was heavily funded by foundations in the US, and we can see the impact that it's had on social change in the US and globally. That's the domino effect. So we need to get philanthropy to fund political movements that are addressing the root causes of the colonial systems and structures. For instance, we have 14, 15 West African countries that are still under the yoke of French imperialism, that don't have sovereignty over their foreign currency and foreign income and hard currency, where they have to deposit their money in the French central bank. There are movements in West Africa trying to address this that continues to put them in the cycle of poverty. So when people ask, why is Niger poor? Why is Mali poor? These countries are not poor because they don't have their resources. They're poor because they're still under the yoke of French colonialism. There are movements that are working in these countries to address this. There are movements that Thousand Currents is supporting around food sovereignty and trying to fight off of the problems that are being created by the likes of Monsanto and other large agricultural industries that are destroying African farmers. So these are the kinds of things that we need to be supporting in the philanthropy space, so that when we talk about decolonization, yes, there are practical solutions and barriers, and I want to talk about those, but we also need to recognize, how do we support the political ambitions to address the root causes of some of these problems? Having said that, the barriers, so the donors, they come up with 3 barriers. One is visibility. We don't know who's out there. We don't have offices everywhere in the global South. We can't see organizations that we want to fund in the refugee space in Uganda, or in the Ebola crisis in Liberia, or in the earthquake response in Nepal, or whatever it may be. So there's an opportunity for us to create a very easy way to make those connections happen and to make those organizations very visible, so that there will be no more excuses. And it's not a good use of resources to ask foundations or bilaterals to open offices in every country in the world. So we have developed a prototype for this online platform called Kuja Link. Kuja in Swahili means come. And basically local organizations are going to be uploading their profiles, who they are, when they were founded, what is their income, who's on their board, who are their funders, their partners, basically a very good micro assessment of this institution and their relationships with others. And hopefully that will give an opportunity for those who are searching for new partners, different types of partners, to no longer have an excuse to say, we don't know who to work with. I tell you right now, USAID in Kenya knows about maybe 5, maximum of 10 strong Kenyan organizations. So this is not meant only for foundations. It's also meant for the bilaterals to get to know the second, third tier organizations that they have no relationships with. The ones that they have relationships with are the big national, powerful organizations, elite organizations that oftentimes take up the space. The second barrier that's always talked about is this issue of risk. They can't handle our due diligence. The extreme of that due diligence system, sorry, Dawn, is the USAID rules and regs. I think they probably are some of the worst in all the bilateral donors. So we talk about these targets, but we don't talk about, how do you get an organization that has had 0 investment in their back-end systems, US NGOs are subsidized to develop these massive back end. Why? Because the NICRA system, the ICR system, incentivizes you to have a massive back office. It doesn't actually incentivize you to scale down. This is about this issue of efficiency I've been talking about. This very expensive way of working with the Beltway bandits means that they don't have actually a proper incentive to be smaller, to be more efficient. It's the complete opposite. Whereas the European NGOs have been subsidized by their Dutch governments, their British governments, given this unrestricted funding for the past 50, 60 years. So when we talk about quote unquote capacity, this didn't just come out of nowhere. It came out of serious investment, billions of dollars on the part of global North donors to their own institutions. And that level of investment hasn't taken place in global South organizations. And we're not going to get that investment from Kenyan governments or Ugandan governments. So we have to figure out other solutions to disrupt this narrative of risk. And that way, so Adesso is actually working on a private company called Core, where local organizations can outsource their backend, can outsource their HR, their finance, their procurement, all the pain points that make them risky. And hopefully, if they're assessed as high risk today, within a span of 6 months to 1 year, they could be assessed as low risk and maybe get and manage direct funding from the likes of USAID or Gates Foundation or whoever may be. So that's the second barrier. The third barrier that we hear about from particularly the bilaterals and not so much the foundations, except maybe some large foundations, is that they want to write big checks. They love the UN and they love these big INGO consortiums because they want to write 5, 10, 20, 50 massive amounts on the side of the US, sometimes $70, $100 million grants that are going out in these massive RFPs. And so, so how do you address that? Well, the one solution to that NIR is working on is to create national funds, like a pooled funding mechanisms, not the ones managed by the UN or the World Bank, but led by civil society in that country that have different windows around health, education, humanitarian, whatever it may be. And NIR is piloting this in West Africa. They're looking at piloting one in Congo and maybe one in Somalia. And they've just started a change fund, which is a humanitarian fund at the global level that will hopefully have different windows. And now it started with a humanitarian window. And they've given out in 72 hours funding to local organizations in 3 crises of Afghanistan, Yemen, and Somalia. In a matter of 72 hours, the money was released. So there is a way to program that is low risk, that is very responsive and very flexible to local organizations in a humanitarian crisis. And so there's an opportunity to expand and work with NIR in piloting more of these funds and creating a more global South-led infrastructure on funding, so that right now we won't, hopefully in the future, we won't have any more excuses around writing those big checks. So we are being purposefully propositional and coming up with some practical solutions to these problems for the new ecosystem that we want to see. But at the same time, we can't forget the political element. And that's why it's very important for me that we support these movements and we support these efforts like what Thousand Currents is doing. And we need to scale that up in a much, much more serious way to address the root causes of the colonial manifestations of aid and why the system is broken.
Thank you, Dagan. And Dawn, I see you raised your hand. I was going to come to you next, but you've got your hand raised. What is your response to, maybe it was Dagan's point or maybe it was one of the earlier points?
Well, I just want to again say I agree entirely with those points. We do have a challenge with the way we assess risk. And we are right now in the process of looking at what we call our risk appetite statement to modify it in ways that reflect exactly what Dagan was talking about. We're also looking at mechanisms where we can simplify our own procedures. You know, things like a fixed amount award, where you give a relatively small award to a local partner in order to develop their capacity. And when I say capacity, I don't mean they're simply their capacity to go through our regulations, because we need to simplify those regulations. there is now a procedure which we call the expedited practices package, where if you're a relatively small actor and you're accessing a relatively small amount of money, the procedures are simplified dramatically. I really would urge our partners listening on this call to go to a new website we've established, work with USAID.org. That's sort of a one-stop shopping mechanism. I also wanted to say I agree entirely that we have in the past tended to go for very large contracts and grants. You know, it's a lot easier to sign a $500 million, what we call an IQC, with a large, Western-based consortium than it is to do $500 million contracts with local actors. And so what we're trying to do is change that system. And in fact, if you look at the 50% metric, we've structured that so that it's project-based, not value-based, in order to make sure that we're doing more and more relationships with local partners and not just one big contract. I also agree entirely with Dagan's point that we, in many countries, know the elite NGOs locally, but we don't have the links we need with our local partners in the communities around the country. And we're trying to address that, including by sharing more power within our own system with our local and employees who do have connections in many cases with those communities. The last thing I wanted to say is that Dagan is also right when she talks about the need for policy coherence. It makes absolutely no sense to be investing in certain agricultural processes in Africa if we then have trade constraints that undercut all of those efforts. We have to incorporate the concept of locally led development and humanitarian assistance at the highest levels of government where the policy is being decided. And that's one of the really important reasons that Samantha Power was named to the National Security Council, first time it ever has happened, because she is raising these concerns at that level.
Thank you, Don. I want to move to questions from the audience, and we've had a number of them. And I want to start. Let's see. Data from the Siegel Family Foundation has a question. Data, you want to jump off mic and say it, or do you want me? If not, I'll read it. But there you go.
Asked questions in the chat, but I wanted to give a big shout out to Degan, Don, and Salome and Abby. This is a really tough topic, and my question was particularly to Don around who develops and who rolls out the strategy, because change brings change. Oftentimes, what we have seen around this particular topic for the last decade has been that the folks who have been always implementing the same programs are the same ones to come up with new programs. I was curious what's going to change this time around.
Well, the key thing that's changed right now is, well, two things, I would say. Actually, three things. One is the power of the South, which is something we listen to all the time. I think the dynamic has shifted. Secondly, we have an experience over the last 10 to 12 years of what worked and what didn't work. And we know, for example, that simply changing our procurement requirements isn't going to do it, or simply providing additional resources to local actors isn't going to do it without changing the power dynamic. And the third thing, which I think is remarkable and very few people have really noticed, is that the political climate in the United States, and this just refers obviously to USAID, has changed dramatically. We have Congress providing us flexibility on our Central America Locale program that they never provide. They're giving us the ability to do this over many years so we don't face challenges with pipelines. They're giving us resources that we can use for our own operating expenses. They are even giving us the right to ignore earmarks until the final part of a project. And so we have the ability now to let our local partners not only define, the way we work, but even the sectors we work. I would also add that we're seeing the same from, Interaction in the United States, which is the consortium of 180 organizations that work internationally. They have been in the lead on localization and recognizing that it's going to affect how they do business. We're even seeing incredible documents from the development contractors, the for-profit organizations. And if you haven't read the document that the Council for International Development Companies has written, it is a full-throated endorsement of localization. Now, it does say localization in effect on our terms, but this is a dramatic change in the environment. I remember when we were doing this under the first Obama administration, I still have scars from the letters that we got saying you're risking American taxpayers' dollars, and you're really going to let those people in developing countries define where you're going to go, and de facto threats of subpoenas before committees. So that has changed.
Yeah, it's a really good and interesting comment about how the political environment in the U.S. has changed, and I would also assert a lot of that is from social movements helping to move that political change. Anna, you've had your hand up. I want to pass it to you for a question.
Hello, everyone. Anna Bruni Sabhani here. I'm the founder of the Confluencers. Firstly, thank you, everybody, for this topic of conversation. It has been the reason I joined the sector for a few years, so I'm just so excited that everybody's here to talk about it. I have a quick reflection and a question. The reflection is really one of the things I've noticed through my conversations with tens of nonprofits every month is the role that funders and intermediaries play. And the way a book described it once is sometimes we see ourselves as like we grow the plants. So we see ourselves as these catalysts, as intermediaries. And it's like we drive the change. But actually, I'm wondering whether part of the problem that we're talking about is the fact that we need to change the role that we see ourselves as funders and as intermediaries to basically the gardeners instead of the gardeners that enable the environment for the plants to flourish, as opposed to thinking that we grow the plants. And this comes from a personal experience where a few funders told me once, well, if you don't get this funding, the project won't happen. That's not true, because nonprofits have many sources of funding. So I suppose what I'm trying to say is, do we need to shift the way we define our role as funders as something that is less critical and put the nonprofits and the people on the ground that are actually delivering the change first and release control? And so my question is, what role does trust play in the future of philanthropy? And do we need to give more space to it? And if so, how?
Salome, do you want to take that one on?
I can take that. Thank you for Anna. Yes, and yes, and yes to what you said. I think, let me just start by saying we are at a really critical moment globally, right? Whether it's climate change, rise in authoritarianisms, extreme and growing inequity, we are at an existential crisis level and point. And so we have to think differently as donors and as a social change sector about how we engage these systemic challenges. We're not doing just service delivery anymore. We need to shift systems, as we've said earlier. And systems change looks very different from project delivery. Systems change takes time, if not decades. It requires many, it's an ecosystem orientation, not an individual organization, and it requires unlimited and unrestricted resources, right? And if that's the case, if that's the moment we're in, then trust is fundamental to that, because we all know we're facing significant crises that we need to resolve, we need to shift systems, but nobody has the answer alone, right? We're figuring it out. We have really great strategies and ideas that need to be supported, but no one can say, here's the solution today, because if that was the case, we would be there, right? And if that's the case, trust is fundamental and strategic. I often get really frustrated when trust-based philanthropy is put in opposition to strategic philanthropy, because I actually think trust-based philanthropy is a rigorous and higher form of strategic philanthropy. It's a part of it. The difference is in strategic philanthropy, we're often centering our strategies, our ideas of what change looks like, what kind of outcomes we're looking for, and asking people to deliver on them. In trust-based philanthropy, we're centering their strategies, right? The movements, the communities, their visions, and their ideas of what change looks like, how they track it, and how they deliver on it. And if that's the case, then the processes in which we advance trust-based philanthropy are equally rigorous. At Thousand Currents, we have a one-year process that we call a catalyst grant when we first meet with a group, where we're getting to know each other in 1 year before we make the long-term commitment and investment that's over 10 years, right? And so there's a discernment process, there's a due diligence process, and a relationship building process that takes place in trust-based philanthropy. But what it allows us to do as an organization is we don't get just a fragmented picture of an organization because we're supporting a project in a restricted way. You're getting the full picture, right? The holistic picture, and you're doing it in relationship with the organization, which allows us to be responsive and to provide the kind of support that they need to meet the complex and adaptive challenges that they face when we're talking about tackling and reforming systems.
Can I just add something to that, Tim?
Please.
I just want to say, yes, I completely echo everything that Salome has said, with just one addition, and that is that oftentimes, though, what I feel happens with trust-based philanthropy, I could be wrong, but I feel like it oftentimes fuels a very limited network that everybody has. And the trust is basically, let's fund Adesso because Tim knows them. Let's fund this group because Salome recommended them, rather than being intentional and getting uncomfortable and going out there seeking those organizations that are not part of oftentimes elite circles. They've won an award here, they won an award there, so everybody funds them because everybody knows them, and now they're trustworthy because they've won one award, So we have to be very careful that we don't perpetuate this idea where trust means I sit in my comfort zone in San Francisco and fund all organizations that are recommended by my peers, but I actually make a real effort to go outside of that network, that exclusive elite network, and seek out organizations that are unknown to me, that I have no relationship with, that I've never heard of, that are very small, they're not even registered. The groups that Siegel Family Foundation and Thousand Currents Fund is another dimension that bilaterals and many foundations would never fund. They're not even registered, many of them. They're just movements. And so to fund that way is, and I think is extremely important. And I also want to say, I think the one philanthropist I see that is completely disrupting this space is Mackenzie Scott. And how she funds is, I think, what we need to see more of. And I would say that I would bet my money on the fact that if we gave more unrestricted money at scale with almost no conditions to Global South organizations, we would see in 10 years really active, thriving social movements, social change, impactful, resilient organizations that are doing dynamic things and are constantly innovating. We would see the ideal civil society organizations taking root that are not under threat from governments because of shrinking space, because they have the resources to fight the government. They have the resources to activate and do advocacy and marketing, the things that they currently don't. They're very vulnerable to shrinking space because they don't have the resources to engage in the government and go toe to toe because they are always in a resource deficit. So I would actually encourage donors to think about funding in that way. And I think I'm really very grateful that Mackenzie is allowing the philanthropy space to have this really important conversation about what real systems change and disruption looks like.
Thanks, Dagan. We had a lot more questions that we're going to have time for, unfortunately. But I wanted to, Abby, I've got a question for you that was presented much earlier from Jamie Drummond. And I don't know, I think Jamie may have had to leave, so he's no longer with us. But so I'll just read you the question. Jamie says that he'd be interested to know how to best measure and track the journey towards decolonized aid and locally led development. What are the thoughts on a tracker which forces accountability and discipline in delivering this shift? And I'm pointing to you, Abby, specifically for this, because I know that Oxfam America has done a lot of similar types of advocacy and tracking and accountability in other spaces.
Yeah, thanks, Tim, and thanks for the question. I didn't see it. I'm glad you're raising it. I think, you know, when we look at what we're measuring, and I don't want us to conflate, and I know we don't all agree on the word localization, but for the point of the conversation, even measuring localization commitments as decolonization. Obviously, that is one of a suite of things that we need to be talking about and measuring. So financial flow, a tracker that looks at a range of things that also look at the qualitative, looking at partnership, decolonization of knowledge, how resources flow, how investments are made, not just at action, but in terms of the quality of the relationship, but also how organizations are influencing the levers of power in global spaces. Because if we take it up a few notches, let's take vaccine equity and vaccine access in the context of COVID. We know that there are giant the issues that are holding back what has led to an equitable distribution of access to vaccines to end the pandemic. And so in that way, we know that there's certain big pharma who holds power, the TRIPS waiver that we've been advocating for in the People's Vaccine Alliance to try to make fundamental changes about how we could have ended the pandemic years ago, and we wouldn't have the extreme inequality, which I think is symbolic of the other inequalities and inequities that we've been talking about today, where over 70% of those in Western or global North countries have access to the vaccine and less than 14% in sub-Saharan Africa. And we know that if vaccine productions could be, if patent rights were waived, they could be producing them locally. And so I say all that to make the point that we need to look at a suite of things that are being measured and tracked, and we should all be able to. I know at Oxfam we are spending a lot of time looking at our internal change processes of how we're looking at our governance reform and how our Global South affiliates have, we shift the power and voice and decision making and how resources flow, but also globally, where we as an international NGO, with all those terms qualified, are using our voice and access to influence the targets and the big global powers where we know the ecosystem is tied up in terms of how decisions and resources can change and flow differently. So I think the answer is we all need to be holding ourselves accountable and tracking. And if there were a set of metrics that I know some of we all could be signing up to, we can see how together as allies and part of bigger movements, we can make systems change.
Thank you, Abby. With extreme apologies to those who asked questions that I didn't get to, and to Daniel, who's patiently had his hand up, but I'm just worried we're not going to have time to finish. So I want to ask all of those in the audience to put in the chat, what is one nugget? I often think in terms of nuggets. When I come to events like this, I want to come away with at least one nugget. What is one nugget of information or new learning that you will take with you? And I encourage you all in the audience to put that in the chat. And while I ask the panelists to make a final comment. So for the panelists, what I'm asking you to do is, and just take 60 seconds each, please. What is a key takeaway that you draw from? I mean, you came to this event, this session, with a lot of information, a lot of experience on this topic. What is either one learning you had or one really important point that you would want all of the audience members to leave with? And I'm going to start, Dawn, with you.
I can't even clear my breath in a minute, so I may violate that. But the first thing that I've learned is that we have a committed set of partners who have thought these issues through, who we need to rely upon. The notion that we are in Washington going to develop a localization agenda is the ultimate oxymoron. This has to come from the field. It has to be led by the field. It has to be driven by the field. And what I think is really important is that we get into a situation where even in those discussions, the power dynamic shifts. The administrator at the Skoll Foundation pledged the United States at the World Forum, pledged that USAID will support a global convening that is going to, we hope, take place by the end of the summer. But we are right now in the process of talking to a wide variety of people, including people actually on this call, who would help co-convene it to make sure it takes place in a power neutral setting. Because when we talk to partners right now, we know that they are holding back on occasion. They don't want to insult us. They want development assistance dollars from us, but we can't afford to be polite in this space. We have to talk about colonialism. We have to talk about white gaze. We have to talk about racism. And unless we put those issues on the table, and I was delighted that we did during this conversation, we're not going to solve this problem.
Great. If you'd asked me 10 years ago if I'd heard someone from USAID talking about we need to talk about racism and white supremacy, I would have shaken my head in disbelief. So thank you for that. Salome, over to you.
If I had to say one thing, just move the money, move it in large amounts, move it to movements, those who are doing the political systemic changes work that's needed, and do it in the long term. But that's going to take work and time, right? But you can do it now, as Dagan reminded us, Mackenzie Scott is doing it, right? She's doing it at large scale. I think there are conversations we can have about who's doing the due diligence and how do we disperse power there too, but we can do that. Start from where you are. But I just want to leave you with some questions. To do that, you have to stretch parameters in your organizations. So what parameters are you going to stretch? You have to take risks. So what risk are you going to take? And you have to bend, if not break the rules. So how are you going to bend and break the rules to be able to do this work?
Thank you. Move the money, learn as you go. Abby.
Well, thank you. Yes, move the money. Well, also, it's an and, I'd say. While direct financial partnerships aren't the entirety of the localization approach, it is really a critical part that can't be ignored. And I think it's truly important that USAID and all of us, and I know that responsibility that international organizations, so-called international, have, to not lose focus on real systemic change. We have a responsibility to keep pushing ourselves, that the uncomfortable part of ourselves, and stay active and be radical and continue to push these uncomfortable learnings and truths that we have not made the progress on to date, despite talking about it and trying to make change with levers that we might have in our control over decades. And no one really is against localization or local-led development at all right now. But with that agreement comes a real risk that everyone thinks we're on the same page and no one is taking that big action. Although, Dagan, your points about some of the big philanthropists and those who are making the changes, those need to be the model, the icebreaker for the future. And change is going to come as we all together take an aggressive approach. And we really want to push for that. And we need to keep our eye on the locally led development call to action while looking at the big systems.
Thank you, Abby. Very well said. And Dagan, we have a minute left and need you to take us home.
Okay, thank you. I think a couple things. One, I want to say that for someone, Andy made a comment earlier that that Dagan and Don have patience that's that he's surprised by our patience in engaging in these issues for all these years. To be honest with you, this is the first time in a long time that I was a bit hopeful. And the reason I'm hopeful is because of the disruptors like Mackenzie Scott and how foundations are leaning into this uncomfortable space. And even Samantha Power. I hope that Samantha Power can revitalize these commitments that have been dead for a few years now with bilateral community. I really want her to lead the charge in the bilateral space, but I think Mackenzie Scott is leading this on the philanthropy space. And I'm really excited about the possibilities that we can finally start talking about not only funding local organization, because that has been like the biggest battle, but funding in unrestricted way, funding long-term and funding at scale, which we have never even thought was even a possibility, because the key to this impact that we keep talking about is we need to create resilient civil societies. We need to even go to the next level and start talking about how do we help these organizations to have endowments, to be financially independent, because it's very hard to be an activist, to be a social change maker, if you're constantly worried about being blacklisted because of the things that you're saying. And these, if we are serious about supporting political change and movement building, we really, really need to support these institutions to become financially resilient. Adesso has been blacklisted in the past, and you know, and it's extremely devastating financially. Didn't stop us, but we continued. But not everybody, I think, is as a lot of people are scared, and they rightfully should be. So we need to get the fear out of the equation. We need to get the hopelessness out of the system, and give some hope and some longevity to the CEOs, the leadership, so that they can think about their future and really implementing a vision that is defined by them, not defined by others. Because once you have scale, once you have endowments, once you're financially resilient, you can say to a donor, you know what, I don't agree with you. I don't like implementing this project in this way, and be able to walk away with your head held high. And that's what we want to see.
Thank you, Dagan. I love that. Hopefulness. How can we hold hopefulness and not have the sense of complacency, but have the sense of urgency to move forward on these issues, and recognizing we still have so far to go. We need to hold both of those at the same time. And thank you so much, all four of you, for this discussion. I was captivated by it. Thank you to the audience and for how engaged you were in sticking through a 90-minute session. And apologies to all of you whose questions we didn't get to. We will be following up with a link to this, along with some additional information. We'll follow up by email by the end of this week. I thank you all. Sorry we ran 2 minutes late, but this was a fabulous, fabulous conversation. So thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your day.